Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed. Namaskara, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening, and welcome to this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. My guest this week is Lauren Watkins. Lauren and I met each other at the University of Central Oklahoma, and one of the major reasons that we had this conversation today was because of a topic she's doing her research on currently. Um, it is associated with the sort of discrepancies in healthcare provided to trans people and gender non-conforming people. So it's a can of worms that a lot of us tend to avoid to open, but it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had. So we do talk about those aspects, and we also talk about some of the general topics associated with um, stigmas towards these people. So there's a ton to take away from it, even if we come from conservative backgrounds. We can always keep an open mind towards these conversations and hear what there is to say about a lot of these things that we're probably not aware of. So there's a ton to take away from it, and I hope that you do take away something from it. So without further ado, I present to you Lauren Watkins on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. Hey Lauren, how's it going?
Hey, it's going pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate you joining me, and yeah, I appreciate you wanting to have this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm really honored that you asked me to even come and speak. So thank you for that. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, of course, of course. So before we get started, if you could let everybody who's listening and watching know who you are, what you do, any likes, dislikes, the whole spiel, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Okay. So my name is Lauren Watkins, and I am a senior at UCO, and I'm studying biomedical sciences biology with minors in psychology and women's gender and sexuality studies. I am the president of the Peer Health Leader Association, and I'm a sexual health ambassador. I have a 1 year old golden doodle. His name is Lincoln. And just some like things about me. I like to do things outdoors. I'm a serial hobbyist as well. I like to change my hobbies every month. And yeah.
Cool, cool, cool. That's awesome. Anything that you dislike about, like it could be as mundane as laundry or dishwashing or anything.
Ooh, good question. Yeah, I'm not a fan of laundry. Trying to think about things that I dislike. Something
Mm.
that's ironic is I'm a vegetarian, but
Mm.
I'm not the biggest fan of vegetables. So I'm gonna let that
Oh,
one sink in.
okay. Hey, I mean, as long as you're, it's as long as it's working for you, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, right? Like, I don't know.
Yes.
How does that work for you mentally? Like when you're not necessarily the biggest fan of vegetables, but then you're vegetarian. How does that work?
So I eat like a lot of legumes and like I'll eat some
Mm.
vegetables, but I'm not like I don't love them. Like when I get pizza, people are like, "Oh, do you want a veggie pizza?" And I'm like, "No, I just want a cheese pizza." I'm like, just because I'm a vegetarian is not like I'm like vegetables all the time.
Mm, mm.
And I also eat
Interesting.
like tofu for my protein. Yeah, I
Mm,
kind of adapt because I am not the biggest fan of vegetables.
mm. Did that did so? were you vegetarian since you grew up, or was that something that I know we're going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I'm just curious. Were you vegetarian since you grew up, or was that a change that you made?
It actually was a change that I made within the past year. So I've been a
Mm,
vegetarian since last November,
mm,
kind of like the end of October. So I'm actually coming up on like a year anniversary for it.
nice.
I did it because I wasn't feeling the best. I was kind of sick for a little bit, and my
Mm,
doctor was like, "Go vegan," and I was like, "No." And he's like, "Well, okay, well maybe try like vegetarianism." And I was like, "Okay, like I can try that." But the funny thing is like after a week, I was ready to kind of give up. I was like, "Yeah, like I don't like it. This is not fun." But then my family was like, "Yeah, like you wouldn't be able to do that." And I was like, "Oh." So now I'm almost a year in just to kind of like
mm,
prove them wrong.
mm. Interesting. Why not veganism? If that's the question I can ask.
Well, I like eggs and like I like ice
Mm,
cream. It that would be I don't think that I could sustain veganism. There's too many things that like even with um, you know, hand like wallets or whatever, like vegan leather. There's just a lot to
mm,
get into. And if you don't do it right, you can also get sick. I've had several friends that have gone vegan and had to quit because of them getting sick. And I don't think I have that type of discipline to be a vegan. So props to people that are. Um, I don't think that I could.
mm. Do you think that I mean, because we're talking about this, I'm going to indulge a little, and then we can switch to the main topic of conversation. But in terms of, you just said there, like, there's a sense of wanting to go all the way when you go vegan. Does it? And this can be generalistic. It doesn't have to necessarily be about your experience or your thoughts specifically, but just your opinion. Um, Is there this sentiment around like the community of veganism and vegan culture, if you will, that you have to go all the way as soon as you start? And do you feel like that can be the reason why a lot of people don't try it?
Yes, and I've actually I've joined Facebook groups for being vegetarians and vegans, mainly so I could kind of see like how other people went about it and just like general advice. But yes, I would kind of say that a lot of people are like all or nothing. Um, Honestly, it can kind of get a little bit toxic. Um,
Mm,
One of my things is like not everybody's body can support veganism. Like to be vegan or to be vegetarian, to be able to purposefully choose what food that you're going to eat is a privilege. And so for people to say like everyone should be vegan, like no, that's not sustainable for everyone at all. Um, but I forgot the original question.
no, you're good. It was just about like that fact that do you think the this culture of having to go all or nothing can be like hindering?
Yes, yes, and like I think that people need to be more graceful with like themselves because it's not easy. I mean, going from 20 21 years of eating meat and like I had like tacos for lunch, like from taco trucks every day. It's definitely um I don't think if I would have had that little like motivation push from my family, I probably wouldn't have kept up with it. But I think that, yes, people definitely kind of have an all or nothing mindset, and I definitely don't think that it has to be that way.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with you because I think everybody adapts differently, and it's not possible for everybody to just drop meat eating like cold
Yeah,
turkey. I didn't
yeah,
intend like no pun intended over there, but um, it's yeah, it's just fascinating how we think that we can just drop everything and go all the way, but it doesn't work that way. But anyway, that was just sort of a bit of a
a tangent.
side
That's
note from what
okay.
we yeah, a bit of a tangent. But speaking of our main topic of conversation, we sort of I remember you mentioning, was this on Facebook or was this someplace else? I can't remember. But you had
Yes.
mentioned Yeah, you'd mentioned something about your topic of research and what you're doing currently. So, could you sort of mention what your topic of research is and expand on that a little, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, so my research, the title of it is "Healthcare is Not a Binary: An Analysis of the Care of the or the Quality of Care of Trans Patients." I initially started my research last year. I presented it at the LAR symposium at UCO, and I kind of how I got into it was kind of interesting, but it was from um, my shadowing experiences and also just talking to people in my life that are close to me and their experiences with being in the community and with healthcare, and then even more so having trans people tell me about their experience or gender nonconforming people tell me about their experiences. But basically, what mine is right now is it's kind of a scanning overview of a lot of issues surrounding healthcare for GNC people. So, like accessibility, misinformation, also lack of knowledge from healthcare providers on how to take care of them, and kind of giving like a synopsis of these issues, but then also going forward, having some possible ways that we can mitigate it, and especially starting at the level of medical schools and then moving up, and some smaller scale solutions as well.
Hmm. That is fascinating, and I did mention this to you. Sorry if the mic caught my stomach just growling there, but anyway, I probably shouldn't have brought that up if it didn't come through. But anyway, uh, was this, and like we spoke about it briefly before we got started. Um, there is, or we don't talk about things like this as much, and bring shining some light on it is always helpful to give perspective, even if you're not necessarily a person that agrees. Because I mean, I think not everybody's going to agree. That's just the way of life, unfortunately. But the fact that people are shining some light on this can always add to that perspective of at least understanding that this thing exists. So that's great that you're doing that through this research. Did you, well, when you brought up this topic with your supervisors or people around you, did you feel any sort of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Like
Some sense of
resistance.
resistance or negativity in any way?
Not from like my mentors or the people that I'm surrounded with. So I do my research through the center at UCO, which is a LGBTQ plus research and women's center. And so whenever I brought the topic up, everyone was like, "Yes, like please do that. I think that's great." So in terms of the people that I surround myself with, no, but there have been some outside people that have not been as excited um, about my research, but it's important and I'm going to continue with it.
That's fair. That's fair. And why do you think that is, if you don't mind my asking?
Um, it can be for a lot of reasons. Um, I think the main being transphobia and
Mm.
ignorance surrounding trans people. A lot of people think that they're kind of entitled to information for gender nonconforming or trans people. There's a morbid curiosity surrounding trans people, and they're just trying to live their life. They're just trying to exist, but their existence for some people is just controversial. But
Mm.
yeah, so
I'd like to use the word morbid curiosity just to sort of expand on that a little. Why did you choose those words specifically to explain that?
So we actually, it's a term that's used, and I don't want to make like a wide generalization, but with there are instances of healthcare providers kind of it's called morbid curiosity because in like whenever you're taking an assessment with a patient, um, they're getting information that is not relevant and it's just out of like personal curiosity. So, say they're treating a trans patient for a cold, and they start asking them about gender reaffirming or affirming surgeries or procedures, and stuff like that. And it's like that's where the morbid curiosity part comes from. Just kind of delving into things that are not relevant to what's going on.
Okay. Do you think any curiosity helps with this topic of conversation, or is there like a certain factor that can possibly not make it the most comfortable thing to be curious about? Excuse me.
So I think you're fine. I think that curiosity is great. That's kind of what initially started me down my path with all of this. But it becomes an issue whenever people's curiosity is like when they're specifically like they come across a trans person, GNC person, and they start asking them all of these questions. That's what Google is for. These people are not. If they're happy to share, that's great. We love it. But sorry about that.
It's okay.
Um, but curiosity is good, but you're not entitled to get these answers to your curiosity from trans people just like them just existing. That is what Google, like I said, that's what Google's for. You can read about all kinds of experiences, and have conversations that kind of don't have to happen with like the people themselves. If they're open to it, yes, but it can kind of get to a point where, you know, you're not entitled to that information about, whomever.
That's an interesting point in terms of um, you can be curious about it, but it's not necessarily. It doesn't have to necessarily be the case that you are um,
Like seeking out these
entitled to the
people.
result. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
That's an
Um,
interesting point. Yeah.
yes, like one of the main points of curiosity for people is what's in people's pants. And that's kind of where it's not uncommon at all for trans people to be asked like, have you had bottom surgery, like what's in your pants? And it's like that is completely inappropriate. Why are we asking people about their genitalia? Like it is no one's business,
Mm,
except potential partners type of thing. Like, there are boundaries that need to be set.
mm. I mean, I guess part of it is also just common sense, right? Like you don't go around asking random strangers about their genitalia, even if they're straight. You don't necessarily go and
Exactly.
ask somebody how big this is or how small that is. Like,
Yes.
yeah,
So
it's
like,
it's just common sense. Sometimes, yeah.
yes, like why aren't trans people afforded um the same like respect? It's very
Mm,
interesting
mm. Well, why do you think that is? Why do you think that they're not necessarily given that respect?
because they're a marginalized group of people.
Mm,
And yeah, point blank.
mm. Do you feel like that's an Oklahoma thing, or do you feel like that's uh, the US in general or the world? I mean, I guess it's a bit of a rabbit hole over there, but yeah, like the sense of marginalization, is that something that you see more often in Oklahoma in comparison to other parts of the country? Or.
So honestly, I can't speak to any data on that in terms of
Mm,
like everywhere else, but in from what I've been reading and kind of like where my research has taken me, it is it's interesting in Oklahoma, because we have a big aspect of religion.
mm,
Um, yeah, there's a lot of factors that play into that.
mm, mm. Yeah, because generally speaking, Oklahoma itself is quite conservative in comparison to other parts of the country.
Say like New
Um,
York or Chicago.
sure, sure. Uh, do you think it's also just people not keeping an open mind in a lot of ways?
Yes. Yes. Also, people kind of being scared of what they don't know.
Hmm.
Um, that's a lot of instances where trans people are murdered for the fact that they're trans. They're beaten severely for the fact that they're trans. But a lot of that will come from like fear, like other people not understanding and them lashing out because of it. And
Hmm.
it stems from not having an open mind, not being accepting to people of different gender identities than you, different sexual orientations. So yes, I would say that that is definitely a contributing factor.
Hmm. And in terms of the research that you've done so far, is it Oklahoma specific or is it specific to the US?
So it's specific to the US right now. My stats I kind of took from a larger pool, and like my statistics include like so trans people are one of the most at risk groups of people, especially POC trans
Hmm.
people. And so it would kind of be, in order to get a good data sample, I went more widespread with um, where I wanted to get my information from.
Hmm. And so far, like, do you see any sort of variations in terms of like people of color versus Caucasians versus African Americans? Like, do you notice that there's a difference over there too?
In terms of how they're treated, or
Yeah.
yes, yes. So this is not only just in the case of trans people, but just people of color in general in healthcare settings. There's also the intersection of cultural competency. That's a whole nother thing. Um, but so being trans and then also being a person of color is kind of like a double whammy in a lot of ways. But we'll see that like African American trans people can be some of the highest risk people based on a lot of factors. But yes, it's a factor as well.
Hmm. And in the sort of trends that you've been noticing through your research, has there been like an uptick in any way, or if not, oh well, before we go into the uptick, what are some other factors that are hindering this sort of expansion to where healthcare providers and hospitals and just like the healthcare system in general is a lot more accepting of trans people or GNC people?
Okay, I'm trying to condense that question. So you're
Yeah,
asking like what are the issues surrounding it, like with healthcare, with like where does it start from type of thing. Okay,
yeah, yeah.
so it starts, it can be at any point in education, but I'm going to specifically focus on medical school curricula, and also trainings for physicians. So um, we've actually found that it's not necessarily that physicians like don't want to treat trans patients, or whatever it may be. It actually comes from like a lack of knowledge. um, Medical school curricula, um, they will have an emphasis on diversity and inclusion, but usually anything surrounding LGBTQ plus people, it's like a blip of what they're taught. And I would say that it starts there for healthcare professionals. And also going out into hospitals, clinics, private practices. There's no trainings on it, because trans people do need, um, they need a different type of care there's just more factors to be taken into consideration. If they're on hormone replacement therapy, um, also if you have a trans person who has to go to the gynecologist, um, and kind of how that experience can be as well. But it definitely starts at the base of medical providers' education, and it's in that curricula. If we had trainings, if we had curricula that was more in depth and more focused on taking care of people that have different needs, um, we would be a lot better off.
Mm. And I'm assuming a lot of this has to do with the fact that, unfortunately, the education system in a lot of ways is quite old, for the lack of a better term, because like the books that we read or anything like that were probably made in like the early 90s or like 2000s with some adaptations, but we're openly talking about this, I think, only since for the like maybe for the past decade and a half. Would you say so?
So you're asking if like healthcare,
Like
sorry,
healthcare
ask,
education, yeah,
yeah.
sure, not a problem. Like healthcare education is a lot of it also possibly because of the fact that the curriculum is not updated to today's world.
I think that it could be a factor. There is a slight upward trend with kind of getting it updated. But yes, it's like it needs to catch up, basically, is one of the
Hmm.
issues.
But while that is the case, I would still assume that having certain drives that help with informing them can also go a long way, right? Like it's not like
Yes.
you can't, even if you can't necessarily update the curricula as quickly, you can always have something to sort of inform people.
Yes, there's like basic so I mentioned this in my presentation that this is a smaller scale solution, is just being like a safe and affirming space for trans people, like on an intake form, having pronouns, having like legal name and then name or their preferred name. Um, Also, um, like if they have whatever is going on with their body, and like however whatever stage they are in their transition or not in their transition, because trans people don't have to transition, um, just very small scale things can really really make an impact on the quality of care
Mm.
that they're receiving.
Mm. And you probably answered this question I'm going to ask over there briefly, but what are some of those things that you've noticed in your research that are helping with um, informing people? Or has there been anything that you've seen, or has there been a lack of that?
Yes, so it's not the best. And in like personal experience, I have heard healthcare providers um, refer to trans people as it.
Mm.
Um, you know, there's a lot of ignorance, and I will probably say that so many times during this interview. But I mean, it's a fact. Um, did that answer your question?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Like in the sense that it it needs to be, or there needs to be a comfortable space to where they can be themselves, but there is a lack
Yes.
of that even on the forms that they're filling out. Um, and maybe this is a bit of a deeper question, or maybe it's not. I don't know, but um, is it just people not catching up, or is it like a sort of tug of war in terms of what principles need to be agreed with?
I think that I would say it's kind of both.
Mm.
There is an issue even among like pre health professional majors there's been commentary on, the questions being asked, like, well, what if I don't want to treat a trans person? And it's like, don't be a healthcare provider. You don't get to pick and choose the demographics of people that you're going to treat based off of something as simple as gender identity. Um, yes, I think that there is the aspect of transphobia, closed mindedness, you have the morbid curiosity. There's just a lot of factors that have kind of like stunted the growth. And also having providers that are like specific to LGBT plus individuals, they face some serious backlash. There's actually repercussions for specializing in, like, I have read about surgeons who specifically focus on gender reaffirming surgeries and the threats that they receive, just the absolute ridiculous and like horrible, offensive, vile things that people say to them for the fact that, they're helping trans people be who they are, and getting those procedures done.
And is that because of that influence of religion and culture and close mindedness?
Yes, 100%. Um,
Hmm.
in my experience, and I'm not bashing religion, but the majority of what I've seen has been from, people kind of using their argument of, well, God made man, God made a woman. There's nothing outside of that. There's a very binary way of thinking,
Hmm.
um, which, it shouldn't be controversial to talk about, sex, gender identity, but it is stigmatized, especially living in Bible Belt, Oklahoma.
But what was that term you used? Bible Bell?
Bible Belt.
Oh, Bible Belt?
Belt. Yeah, like you
Okay,
hold your,
okay.
yeah, Bible Belt.
It's not a term I've heard before, so yeah. Yeah.
That's what
But
Oklahoma's
no,
known
makes.
as. Yeah.
Oh, really? Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Um, you said something interesting there in terms about like doctors who help with these gender affirming treatments being attacked. But at the end of the day, do you think a lot of it is just understanding the fact that it's a choice that those people are making and those doctors are making, and that if we're accepting of this is going to be a very like sort of convoluted question, I guess, but if we're willing to accept that a person has the choice, they have the choice to make, should we also be accepting of the fact that they should be able to make this choice in this scenario?
So you were right about it being convoluted. Are you asking in terms of like the healthcare providers that they kind of chose what they're doing and
Yeah, like in the
like,
sense that, yeah, please go ahead. You can. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
no, you're fine. But basically that like they chose this and they knew the repercussions, possible repercussions going in. That sort of, or
No, no. So basically, let's say, for example, I choose to. Um, well, now that you mentioned that, that's another interesting point that we can maybe expand into. But um, what I was going to go with, like, if so, I'm not. But for example, for conversation's sake, let's say I'm one of those people who believes in the fact that everybody has a choice to make. They can choose to do whatever they want to do, and so on. But then when it comes to doctors making this choice, or people who want to switch genders, for the lack of a better way of putting it, want to switch these genders, I'm like, no, that shouldn't be happening. Do you feel like there's a lot of that?
um that's actually one area that I don't have the data in. but
It's gonna be your
what it
opinion.
yeah. Yeah, I can definitely see people being denied. We see this a lot in adolescents or people who, teenager age people where their families aren't accepting and they're wanting to start HRT, hormone replacement therapy, maybe start wearing binders for their chest, different things that are reaffirming to their gender. Um, Yeah. I'm trying to remember the beginning of that question.
You're good. No, basically, I think it's maybe what I'm trying to kind of get at is, and again, like before I say this too, I do need to add that there is a lot of nuance to this, and it's not like a binary in terms of understanding, oh, it's either this way or that way. But it's just sort of like the hypocrisy associated with being a
Y-
believer in choice. Does
yes.
that make sense? Like, if you have the choice to do whatever the hell you want to do, okay, that's fine. But shouldn't you also be open to letting another person
Yes.
have that
I
same?
I do not think that it is appropriate at all for and unless it's in the case of like a trans person, if it would mess with their like physical health. There are instances of like for people starting testosterone, like you have to monitor their levels, like you have to make sure that it's not, make sure their kidneys are okay. Um, but I don't think that it's appropriate for healthcare providers to make that decision based on their belief system. I think that is incredibly unethical.
Hmm. Now that you mentioned that, do you still think that there is room for conversation in terms of them suggesting that it shouldn't be done if a person has certain health conditions that can in turn make it a lot harder for them to make that change?
So as long as the care, like the quality of care, like as long as it doesn't stem from the fact that their personal beliefs are interfering in their ability to be a physician or to be a healthcare provider, then yes, there's definitely room for conversation. But I also think that exploring every single alternative that is possible and trying in every way that you can to help whatever individual um, be more comfortable in their own body. Gender dysmorphia is a very big aspect of being trans, and any way to kind of, it's always going to be present, but any way to like mitigate that and just, you know, help these people out, you know.
Mm. And could you expand on the idea of gender dysmorphia for someone who's not necessarily aware of what exactly that is?
So basically, to be put simply, um, it's being born in like the wrong body. So, like a guy, a male guy, whatever, being born in a female body. If that, it's like an intense feeling of not belonging in your own body, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
your
And
your biological sex does not match up with your gender identity.
hmm. Okay. So is that more of like a? I'm trying to make sure that I'm not getting convoluted with this, but is it more like a psychological thing? I'm sorry if it's very crass, but is there like a better explanation in terms of how that gender dysmorphia is influenced, if it has any physiological influences, or is it mainly psychological?
It's have you ever heard of like body dysmorphia?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So it's the dysmorphia part being the same. But yes, very much psychological, but it's a result of these people and their biological sex and their gender identity not aligning.
Hmm. I hate to sort of ask this question, but I think it's a conversation that also maybe needs to be had. Do you think that, and if you're not comfortable talking about it, that's totally fine. I understand. Um, do you think that because, and I hate to put it this way, but I've heard some sort of stories, not full stories, but like sort of people talk about it here and there. Do you think that people make this choice of becoming, like changing their genders or so on and so forth, just to seek acceptance
Uh,
because of the fact that they're not being accepted for who they are right now? I don't know if that
so
makes sense, but
kind of. So you're asking, do you think that, so like I'm a cis woman.
mm.
So are you saying that, do you think there's people like, say I was like, oh, I'm going to transition to a guy, that way I can have like male privilege type of thing?
Not necessarily. So I guess let's put it this way. Now,
You can be direct with your
it's
question. Just ask it.
yeah, no, I was just trying to sort of formulate it in my mind too, in terms of how to sort of
Articulate
not how
it.
to word it, but like yeah, how to articulate it. Yes. So in terms of now, say for example, like okay, veganism is a big thing, and to feel like you are accepted by people around you, you become vegan, but you're not necessarily
Oh.
inherently yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, not at all. No, not at all. So yeah, I don't think that's a valid point at all. You don't
Mm,
get to, so gender identity is an internal, like an internal sense of how you identify. That's like saying that a lot of my friends are queer, you know, or say like you have a straight friend in a group,
mm,
in a group of queer people, and sexual orientation isn't a choice. It's like saying I'm friends with all these queer people, and to be accepted, I'm gonna be queer now. Like it
mm,
doesn't work like that. No, not
yeah,
at all.
yeah.
It's a good question, and I think
Hmm.
that that's a good point to make. But yeah, not at all.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've heard of any anecdotes, but can you possibly see that happening too, where people are just like, "Oh, I see this person being accepted for being who they are, and I feel the need of love in my life, and I want that." So I know, but you said it's not how it works. But
Yeah.
do you is that like an outcome of society? Unfortunately.
I don't think that I don't think that that's I don't want to say valid.
Mm,
Um, but I really don't think that it's a valid point
mm,
because trans people, the way that they're treated, there's so many factors. You know, the way
yeah.
that they're treated is absolutely horrific and awful in a lot of cases. And I don't
Mm,
think that people, like, why would you put yourself in that position?
true.
And
Very true.
that's kind of one of the points is, like would these people go through all of like hormone replacement therapy, gender assignment, reassignment surgery? Like, why would they go through all of these things if it was just like a
Hmm.
phase, if,
Mm,
whatever. So, yeah, I would venture to say that no, people wouldn't do it because it's like trendy. Like, there are some
yeah.
serious issues surrounding how trans people are treated. So I don't think that anyone would be asked to be treated like that.
Mm. And the reason I ask this is because I've heard it being a talking point in like a podcast or two that I've listened to where they were talking about this as like a topic of conversation. So I was
Hmm.
just curious in terms of how like it's observed, like in
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I think,
Uh,
I mean, it's a good question. And I think that, having productive conversations like these, where you can kind of like split the difference on kind of like just a lot of misinformation. But I mean, it's a safe space. We can ask these type of questions. So I think like that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah, because at the end of the day, like, I go back to what I said earlier. Like, if you are happy as a person with the choice that you're making, then who I apologize for my French, but who the fuck am I to like stop you
Exactly.
from, you know?
Amen. Amen.
Yeah.
I 100%. You know what people do with their bodies is none of my business. It is their body. It is their choice. As long as they are not hurting anyone, then why do I care? You know, let people be happy. Let people be their free and authentic selves.
Yeah, and by saying that, I will add that, like if it's a close relative who's sort of going through this phase and, I'm trying to understand, then there's always room for conversation, like we mentioned earlier. But like at the end of the day, if I mean, as the saying goes, treat people the way you want to be treated. If um, you want to be accepted, you don't want people to be sort of being hawks around the way that you live your life, then I guess
Exactly.
the same can be said for the other side too. Um, is a lot of it just hypocrisy?
That's it's one of them. I mean,
Mm,
like I said, you have the influence of religion, you have the influence of close-mindedness, transphobia, misinformation, and also disinformation about
mm,
anything surrounding trans people. I've heard some really wild things, and it's like, where did you get that from?
mm,
Um, yeah, lack of knowledge, ignorance. Um, yeah, there's a lot of things, but I think hypocrisy. It might not necessarily. I just want to say that it's more of conditional
mm,
love. You have people that, I love everyone. I don't care if you're whatever, they give their little spill. But the second that someone that is different from like their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, it becomes very conditional. And I find that extremely interesting.
mm, mm.
But yeah,
Fair point.
hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm, yeah. Um, in terms of where was I headed with this? Okay, let me preface this by my next question by saying this. This is another talking point that I've sort of heard about, where people question if an adolescent should be going through this change because they've mentally not yet. To add more context to that, they say how the brain doesn't develop entirely until you're 20 something or 25 something.
Yes.
I can't get the number right, and I apologize, but
Well, it kind of depends, but yes, it's the development of your dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functioning.
yeah. So that's usually in about the range of like 20 years or something like that, right? Like, I mean, sure, yes, it
Yes.
depends, but yeah. The Another conversation that I've heard is where people are like, how can an adolescent make that choice when they've not necessarily reached a point in their mental state or in the way that their brain is growing to be able to take such a call? Because this change that they make now, there's sort of like there's no coming back from it,
Yeah, yeah, no, I
so
get that. So the trend that I've seen among adolescents is holding off on, and the thing is you can't make a generalization for how an entire group of people um, should be treated in terms of like hormone replacement therapy. It's definitely up to them, their family, But what I've seen is usually at that age, especially like pre-pubescent um, kids, is they'll do a social transition. And so, they will cut their hair or let their hair grow out, and have a name that they feel more comfortable using, um, but do more of a social aspect rather than the physical and physiological changes. Um, so it definitely depends from child to child. And again, as long as their health isn't at risk, I can see the point behind um, people being they're like, oh, they're a kid, they're impressionable. Um, but I mean, you see these kids start from whenever when they can verbalize things, and they're like, I'm a boy, and it's a trend. It doesn't change, but I can understand the hesitancy, and so usually the trend is to do a social transition, and then later in life, whenever they are a little bit older, kind of coming back and reassessing, and seeing where everything is for them.
Hmm. No, that's a fair point because you don't want to sort of jump head in, especially if you're at that age where you are very impressionable and your brain is not necessarily developed to its fullest. So that's a fair point.
Yes, but also I don't want to discredit like trans people's experience, like,
Hmm.
you know but it's kind of, that's a very um it is a controversial topic, but that's definitely up to the child and their family and their healthcare provider ultimately.
Hmm. Fair. Do you um well, two questions. I'll ask the first one that I have in my mind right now. Do you think parents should have a call in the choice that the child tries to make? I mean, no, let's take out the adolescent thing out of the equation because I think in that case, like we just talked about, it's a lot. It's another can of worms that a lot. There's a lot associated with it. But do you think, generally speaking, should parents have an influence on what their child decides to do, even if they're like 20 something?
Oh, so like a young adult.
Yeah, no, not necessarily considering adolescents. Let's sort of put them out of the
Mm-hmm.
equation because even if because they sort of look at them as dependents till they're 18 or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
saying young adults like 20 something, and this can be
No,
just opinion based, but yeah.
no,
Mm.
in my opinion, no. um I've had many friends that's kind of been the age where, if they were able to, get out of their living situation, I mean, they've been waiting forever to be able to, start HRT, kind of start the whole process of the transitioning. But as young adults, no. Um, there could be, there are exceptions to the rules. Um, But yeah, no, they're an adult, they're a young adult. Um, and they definitely have, it is their body. And I think that bodily autonomy is incredibly important. And that is their choice and their prerogative and their liberty.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. Because going back to what we said earlier, right? Like, as long as you're not affecting people around you to where they're dying or whatever, you have the choice to do like whatever you choose to do, as long as you're not going out into the streets and killing people. But sort of the second question that I had that was in my mind. I was asking the first one: is there room for discussion to sort of seeing that people might possibly be getting hate because there's social transitions and not necessarily like, again, I apologize for asking so many convoluted questions. I'm articulating this as we're going, but um, do you think that there can be a lot of negativity because some of them are just making social transitions, whereas others are making the full gender switch? Do you think that the people making the gender switch unfortunately get a lot of the hate because of some people just seeing social transitions being made, where maybe some of them see that there's a lack of skin in the game, if you will? And again, I guess we could put aside like the dependents, 18-year-olds, and so on, and sort of speak about it from young adults to older.
So you're asking about kind of the differences between people who haven't, um, well, but there, that also brings up the point of, I kind of mentioned it before, is like trans people, the second that they say that they're trans, they're valid. They are. They don't owe anyone masculinity, femininity, androgyny. They don't owe anyone a dang thing. Um, I think that that is one of the issues too. Is people will be like, "Oh, like when are you going to transition?" All of these things. Um, I would say though, either way, they're still going to face the stigma behind being trans, the discrimination, just the the overall poor treatment. I would say that they both have their own issues in themselves in terms of like how people are going to treat them if they had just socially transitioned versus having procedures done HRT. I think that they can both exist, and neither one is worse than the other. The existence of both of the sets of groups of people's problems don't negate each other, and they come with their own challenges um, and things that are associated with how people will treat them.
Hmm. Hmm. And would that mainly be because in both cases you are sort of, I guess openly is not the right word, but you are out there as a trans person, like you said. So the sort of, I'm just
But you
trying to
can't.
make sure that I
Yeah, yeah.
understood what you said. Um, so they both will get the same response, for the lack of a better word, irrespective of what side they're on.
Yes, and also there's a misconception that like you can tell if someone's trans. There's something called being like stealth. Um, I think that that's kind of another thing is people just assume like you can look at someone and be like, oh, they're trans. That's not always the case.
Mm.
It's what you call passing.
Can you expand on that? Like passing as in what?
As like say you have a trans guy and he's gone through HRT outwardly, which he is a trans male he's a male, um, but seeing him, you wouldn't know that he wasn't like a cis male. That's what it means to be passing. Like you're like, oh, I thought you were cis type of thing.
Okay, okay, okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, because I'm not necessarily aware of some of these terms, which is why I was just asking for an
Yeah,
explanation. So,
no, and yeah,
uh,
if I say something that, yeah, be sure to ask, please.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. And I had something which sort of just escaped my mind now. Um, what do you think you and I, or people listening and watching, could do to create a safe space?
So one of the most, it's like bottom level human decency is respecting people's pronouns. So say you misgender someone and they're like, oh, actually, I use she, her pronouns, like respecting those. And also, I can understand that there's an adjustment, but people can recognize when you're actively making an effort versus when like you don't care. You're just kind of like, oh yeah, like I forgot my bad type of thing. But creating spaces, just being an advocate for GNC trans people, when there's conversations that are being held, I think that there's a lot of performative allyship for trans people, just also people in the community in general. But, when there's conversations being had that kind of take a turn towards morbid curiosity, someone's blatantly misgendering someone, like standing up for those people, like being an advocate and not letting those conversations, those harmful conversations that perpetuate stigma and just a lot of things surrounding trans people continue, you know. Also, for like elected officials, keeping in mind who we elect, being actively involved in, if there's marches or rallies or whatever that may be. There's a plethora of ways that people can be involved, but just also sitting back and listening, and trans people and their experiences, and like they are valid, but just like letting them exist, like the mere existence of trans people is like so mind-boggling for some people. But they don't always want, like they don't want to always be getting asked all of these questions about what it is to be trans. Like they just want to exist. They're just people, everyday people that they're like everyone else. They've just kind of been put under like a little magnifying glass, or like like under observation. But I think like basic human decency would be a really good place to start.
Mm.
But taking up for them.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful, because yeah, like it's the smallest of things, right? Like that sometimes we don't necessarily see it always. And you mentioned this when you were explaining it, in terms of it can sometimes be performative, and it doesn't have to be that way. You can start small. It doesn't necessarily have to be you going on the top of a mountain and screaming, I accept these people, or anything like that,
Slight
yes, go ahead.
interjection. Sorry. So,
Yeah.
performative allyship is not quite what you think. You
Okay.
were
Yeah,
going.
if you could
You were
expand
going.
that, yes.
Yeah. So you were going more like I love trans people type of like top of the mountain thing. But it's more like, oh yeah, like you're trans, that's cool with me type of thing. But then you're in a group of people and they use like slurs and they misgender people, and then you participate in that. That's performative. It's like being fake, basically. Um, being very, it's performative. Like you're only saying that around whatever groups of people to manipulate them into thinking that you're okay with it, but on the other hand you're actually not, and
Hmm.
you participate in harmful conversations. So that's what I meant by
Okay.
performative allyship. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
No, you're good. You're good. It's okay. It's okay. Um, the other question that I had earlier that sort of escaped, but now it's back. In terms of, you use the words misinformation and disinformation. What would what would be misinformation and what would be disinformation in this sort of scenario of conversation that we're having?
So disinformation is like the intentional spread of not like not correct, not factual information, like purposeful distribution of that. And misinformation is more of like, um, it's just common misconceptions, factors of not knowing, people making assumptions. So that that's the difference. Disinformation has more of like a malicious intent. We see that a lot with a controversial topic with the COVID vaccine. Um,
Mm.
you'll see misinformation versus disinformation.
What would be some examples in this case? I guess I should have mentioned that.
So an example being that vaccines cause autism.
I mean, with
Oh, trans people. So sorry.
yes, no,
I
you're good. You're good.
didn't follow
You're
that one.
good.
Trans people are possessed by the devil. For religious people,
Mm.
things that are kind of like already common misconceptions, and then people kind of taking that and running with it and like saying it as fact.
Mm. Okay, that's fair because I think a lot of the times it becomes a lot harder to make that distinct, like making that separation, especially in a topic like this where maybe there's a lack of nuance in terms of understanding all the sort of plates that are spinning. So yeah, that's the reason why I was sort of wondering about that in terms of disinformation versus misinformation and how or what some examples would be. Um,
I
you
think
know,
that.
yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
You're
go
good.
ahead.
Okay.
No, I was
Uh,
just gonna say like in terms of categorizing it,
mhm.
but yeah, go ahead.
I would say that it comes down to like the intent of it. That misinformation is harmful, but disinformation can be deadly, type of thing. Um,
Mm.
yes, like it's purposefully going out to disinform groups of people to gain whatever agenda is going on. Um, so I would think that that would be the distinguishing factor between misinformation and disinformation.
Okay, fair point. Let's say yeah, that's definitely one of the ways to look at it because um, yeah, like I think it's very easy for like, and doesn't have to necessarily be about the discussion that we're having, but generally speaking, um, they sort of all get muddled up with the two. Everything is just sort of like a mess in that case. So yeah, that was just a sort of thought that I had. But
Yeah.
in terms of like I guess in terms of like a parting thought, which we probably already led with earlier with that previous question about what we can do in everyday life. But if you did have a parting thought about this before we headed into like the latter stages of this podcast, what would that be? And what would you, or well, I guess a better question would be this: what would you want for people to take away from your research and the work that you're doing?
That this is a real issue, and um, trying to articulate this, that trans people are valid. They're not these experiments. They're not a phase. They are who they are, and they don't owe you anything. And you know, um, yes, the issue that I'm specifically focusing on is within healthcare, but we as individuals can start literally now with doing, things that I've mentioned before. Just, trying to be a decent human being. Um, but that, trans people are valid, and they're not, people subject, like they don't owe us information. They don't owe us a damn thing. And I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways is they no one isn't entitled to any information about them. But yes, that is my takeaway for that.
Mm. I definitely agree because even with our own personal lives, right? Like even if you're not trans, you don't want, or even if you're just a straight person or whatever it may be, um, you probably don't want everybody to know that, oh, I don't know, you're in a relationship now. You don't owe it to anybody to sort of tell everybody that, oh, I'm in a relationship or whatever. It doesn't,
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with your life. then why do you need that information?
Yes.
So,
And
okay.
yeah, I had a point. I forgot my point. But I think a lot of why is there's just not as much awareness, I would like to say, as in regards to how trans people are treated. You'll see bits and pieces of it in the media, but you don't have to be trans. You don't have to be gender non-conforming to want to take up for them. Like, obviously, it can be kind of confusing for me to be speaking on this topic for people, but just because an issue doesn't impact you directly, doesn't mean that it shouldn't, like, action shouldn't be taken on that behalf.
Hmm.
um yeah, that's my point.
No, and then that's a great point, and that's a great point to sort of close this part of this segment, or the podcast rather. So thank you so much for sharing everything and sort of going through all my convoluted questions. I really appreciate it. Um, but yeah, we're going to transition into a dissociation game, which is called Bish Bash Bosh, which basically is me giving you 5 different words, one at a time, and you have to respond to those in 3 other words or 3 different phrases. So, for example, if I was to say common, what are the 3 things that sort of come to your mind when I say the word common? That sort of thing.
Common.
Common's
Okay.
common's not the word; it's just an example.
Yeah.
Uh,
What would you
yeah,
wait? So how would you like answer that? Like, common, you'd be like,
same. Um, I don't know.
oh,
How I encourage people to sort of think about this is to
like
respond.
synonyms.
It doesn't have to necessarily be synonyms. It can be the first words that sort of call out to you. Because
Okay.
when the other word that sort of called out to me when I said the word common was different, and another word that's now calling out to me is like person. So it can be anything. Like whatever word is sort of calling out to you
Okay.
as you hear the word that I say.
My
That makes sense.
ADHD is gonna love this. All right, let's get it.
Okay. So the first word is differences. What are the 3 things that are sort of calling out to you when I say the word differences?
Inclusivity, ignorance. If I say that word one more time, and I was gonna say not that different, but that's not a word.
I mean, it's a
Commonality.
phrase. It's a phrase. You can
Okay.
use a phrase too. That's fine. Okay. The second word is nuance.
Uh, this is an interesting game. Nuance, multifaceted, kind of difficult, um, and time consuming.
Hmm. The third word is learning.
Learning, growth, a privilege, and um, important.
Hmm. The fourth word is empathy.
Empathy is what keeps the world going. Um, Consideration and um, good question. I can't think of the third one.
Give me
Humanity.
anything. Okay, there you
Humanity.
go.
I'm definitely
Cool.
overthinking this game.
No, yeah, it's okay. It's okay. It's all good. It's all good. The fifth word, the last word, is similarities.
Similarities. Empowerment. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
I had a word in my mind. It's like solidarity. That's what I was looking for.
Mm.
Solidarity. Um, what was the word again?
Similarities.
Similarities. And collectiveness.
Mm. Hey, that works. So yeah, thank you so much for playing along on this segment of Bish Bash Bosh. It's sort of like a way for through this podcast to sort of see how everybody answers to the same words, because everybody gets the same words. Everybody gets the same 5 words: differences, nuances, uh, learning, empathy, and similarities. And it's interesting to see how a lot of the times, even though we think differently, we live different lives. We respond to them in a lot of similar ways. Um, so yeah, that's just sort of like the goal with this.
That's
Um,
neat. I
yeah,
like that. I'll
yeah.
have to go back and listen to other podcasts and see some similarities and some differences between my answers and other people's.
Actually, like you opened up a field for me to like hit an open goal. We do. Well, I do upload like um, clips of this segment on Instagram. So for those of you who are not aware who are listening, you can always find clips of Bish Bash Bosh on the Instagram page, which I will link below too in the description. So yeah, there's like videos of everybody responding to these 5 words on the Instagram page too. So yeah, you can definitely check that out if because listening each podcast is roughly about an hour. So you could always just listen to these and sort of find out what people responded to these words. So
Yeah,
but yeah,
yeah. I'll have to
yeah.
follow that page. Yeah, I love that. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, just 2 more questions. Well, the last one's not really a question, but the first one being, uh, how do you relate to people?
How do I relate to people? So, in terms of like just making new friendships and like communicating with people,
However you see it. Whenever I said the word, how do you relate to people, or question rather, however you see it.
um, I usually start by finding similarities. I can hold a conversation about a wide variety of topics. So if someone says anything that I have like the tiniest nugget of knowledge about, I will take that and I will run with it. Um, but also kind of just recognizing that, we're all here, we're all existing. Um, and, that alone just kind of recognizing that we all have our experiences, we all have our own things going on. Um, yeah, I guess kind of being empathetic to people and being aware of experiences. That's how I relate to people.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And for the last question, which is not really a question, but more of a request, if you could leave everybody who's listening and watching with a positive thought or something that keeps you going every day, or whatever you're willing to share to sort of close this off.
A
The floor
positive
is yours.
thought. Um, my positive thought, something that like genuinely brings me joy, is whenever I see like other people doing well and other people like thriving. Kind of seeing a friend go from like a rough time to growing into whoever, like who they are now. That's my positive thought. It's like seeing people doing good, growing, learning, challenging whatever they were previously taught, questioning everything. Um, yeah, I hope that answered your question.
No, it does. It does. It does. Because, like having that outlook instead of being envious towards people who are doing well is going to help yourself too. Like, you're not going to be in that negative state of mind if you're positive about the fact and happy for other people. So, like, in terms of an action point, I guess it's simple to say be happy for, be happy when others are happy with how things are going with their
Yeah,
life. Yeah, yeah,
have a gen
that's beautiful.
I have a
Yeah, go ahead.
genuine like care for how people are, doing, like how things are going. So like I love when people do are doing good, and I think like
Hmm.
just these small little things. Um, I think that's important.
Hmm. Well, that's a great way to close this off. So thank you so much for joining me, Lauren. I appreciate you taking the time to do this and like sort of talking about a topic that is not the most comfortable to talk about, but I do feel like it's a conversation that we all need to have. Um, and even if you do have some reservations about, this is for those who are listening and watching, if you do have any reservations towards this topic of conversation, um, we all have been there with something else at some point. So, just keep an open mind and hear out what people have to say. Because at the end of the day, like Lauren said earlier, a lot of it can just be ignorance where you're not necessarily wanting to care. So just be open minded about it and, you know, talk about it. You never know. You might learn something from it. So thank you so much, Lauren, once again for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And for those of you listening and watching, thank you. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek featuring Lauren Watkins. Make sure to check the description box below for other sources of information and content that we've talked about today. Make sure to also mention some things in the comment section that you found interesting, intriguing, relatable, or thought-provoking in this episode. Like this video, share it around, and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to never miss another episode. If you've made it this far, thank you once again. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to these conversations because it just makes this worthwhile. So, thank you once again, and until next time, stay safe, take care, and don't forget to keep your mind open to different perspectives because you never know, random relatability might just be around the corner.